David Hartley had always lived a life that many could only dream of. As a successful billionaire, he owned sprawling estates, luxury cars, and had the freedom to travel the world at his whim. His life seemed like the perfect fairy tale, a dream that everyone around him envied. But it wasn't just his wealth that people admired. David was married to the beautiful Emily, a woman who had supported him through the ups and downs of building his empire. Together, they had everything: fame, fortune, and the kind of love that seemed to last forever. They met years ago when David was just starting his business, and Emily was a young woman with big dreams of her own. Over time, their lives intertwined perfectly. She became his rock, always there to encourage him when things got tough. Emily was his best friend, his confidant, and the woman he thought he would spend the rest of his life with. Their love story was one that everyone admired, and they seemed like the ideal couple, successful, happy, and forever in love. But as years passed, the pressure of running a billion-dollar business took its toll on David. His mind was always preoccupied with work, meetings, and endless hours spent strategizing to grow his empire. Emily, once the center of his world, began to fade into the background. She found herself alone more often than she would have liked, spending days and nights waiting for him to come home, only to be met with empty promises of making time for her. As time went on, their relationship started to change. David's long hours at the office and constant travel caused a strain on their marriage. Emily began to feel lonely, neglected, and taken for granted. She tried to get his attention, tried to remind him of the love they once shared, but it seemed like no matter what she did, she was never enough. The distance between them grew wider, and the love that had once been so strong began to feel like a distant memory. It wasn't that David didn't care about Emily anymore. He did. But his mind was so consumed with work that he couldn't see how much his neglect was hurting her. He thought that as long as he kept providing for her and their luxurious life, everything would be fine. But Emily needed more than just material things. She needed his love, his attention, and his presence. And as the years went by, it became clear that David couldn't give her what she needed. One evening, while attending a gala for a business event, David met someone new. Her name was Sophie, and she was everything David found exciting and fresh. She was young, carefree, and full of life, something David hadn't felt in a long time. Sophie had an energy that pulled him in, and soon, they found themselves spending more time together, enjoying moments of excitement that seemed to remind David of the carefree days before the pressures of business and marriage took over his life. At first, it was innocent. A few casual conversations, a shared laugh, and the occasional meeting at social events. But soon, David began to realize that Sophie was offering him something he had been missing for years: excitement and attention. It was tempting, and David, caught up in the thrill, started to feel a pull toward her that he hadn't felt in a long time. Emily, unaware of the growing distance between them, continued to hold on to the idea that everything would get better. She didn't see the changes happening in David, nor did she suspect that someone else was filling the emotional void that had once been hers to fill. But in the depths of her heart, she knew something wasn't right, even if she couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. David's perfect life was beginning to crack, and he didn't even realize it. What he thought was a perfect marriage, built on the foundation of success and wealth, was unraveling slowly, and soon, everything would change forever. David's life began to shift in ways he hadn't imagined. What started as innocent attention from Sophie soon grew into something more. As their interactions increased, the connection between them became undeniable. Sophie was everything David hadn't realized he needed, a breath of fresh air in his otherwise routine life. She was young, full of energy, and had a carefree attitude that made David feel alive again. She didn't ask for anything from him other than his time and attention, which, in comparison to Emily's expectations, seemed simple and effortless. At first, David tried to ignore it. He told himself it was just harmless fun, a temporary escape from the monotony of his marriage. But the more time he spent with Sophie, the more he found himself drawn to her. She didn't care about his wealth or status, which was something that always seemed to dominate his relationships. With Sophie, David felt like he could be himself, unburdened by the pressure of being the successful businessman that everyone expected him to be. They would laugh together, enjoy simple things, and for the first time in a long while, David felt like he was truly living. Meanwhile, Emily was beginning to notice the changes in David. The late nights at the office became more frequent, and when he was home, he seemed distracted, distant. She tried to talk to him, to ask him what was going on, but every time, he brushed it off with an excuse. "I'm just tired," he would say, or "I got a lot on my plate." Emily could feel that something was wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Her instincts told her that David was withdrawing from her, and she feared that the distance between them was growing wider. One evening, after a particularly cold conversation with David, Emily sat alone in their living room, staring out the window. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. She had been trying so hard to hold on to the man she had married, the one who had once looked at her like she was the most important person in the world. But now, it seemed like he was slipping away, and she didn't know how to stop it. As for David, he was fully immersed in his connection with Sophie. It was easy to get lost in the excitement of being with someone who seemed to offer him everything he had been missing, someone who didn't ask for anything other than his company. The more he saw Sophie, the more he began to question his life with Emily. In his mind, Emily had become more of a partner in business than in love. He had started to wonder if he had made the right choice in marrying her in the first place. Sophie's presence made him feel younger, more alive, and for the first time in years, David felt like he had rediscovered a part of himself that had been buried under the weight of his responsibilities. Despite the growing tension at home, David couldn't shake the feeling of liberation that Sophie gave him. It was easy to justify his actions at first. "I deserve this," he thought. "I've worked hard for everything I have. Why shouldn't I enjoy my life the way I want?" But deep down, a small voice told him that he was crossing a line, one he would regret crossing if he wasn't careful. David's growing attachment to Sophie began to affect more than just his relationship with Emily. David's life began to feel like it was spiraling out of control, but in a strange way, it also felt freeing. The decision to leave Emily wasn't something he took lightly. The guilt gnawed at him, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized he couldn't keep living a lie. He had tried to ignore the growing disconnect between him and Emily, but the distance between them had become too much to overlook. He had been so focused on his work and his success that he had forgotten about the one person who had always been there for him, the woman who had supported him through everything. But now, with Sophie in his life, things were different. He didn't feel the weight of expectations, and he didn't feel trapped by the responsibilities that came with his marriage. Sophie offered him a kind of freedom that he had longed for, but had never known how to express. She didn't pressure him, didn't need anything from him except his time and attention, and for the first time in a long time, David felt like he was truly being seen for who he was. It didn't take long before David made the difficult decision to leave Emily. He moved out of their home, taking only what he needed, and started a new life with Sophie. The process was more difficult than he had imagined. Emily was devastated. The woman who had once stood by him through thick and thin now found herself abandoned, struggling to understand what went wrong. She had suspected for a while that something was off, but the truth hit her like a tidal wave. David, the man she had loved and supported, had chosen someone else, a younger woman who seemed to bring excitement and newness into his life. For David, the decision was final. He believed that starting over with Sophie was the right move. He convinced himself that he had made the best choice for his happiness, even if it meant causing pain to someone who had been a part of his life for so long. The guilt was there, but he tried to push it aside. In his mind, he had already justified his actions. He told himself that it was time for a fresh start, that he deserved to be happy, and that Emily would eventually move on too. As he settled into his new life with Sophie, David tried to focus on building a future together. They moved into a new, luxurious apartment, and David continued his work in business, although now he had more time to spend with Sophie. It felt like a new chapter, one where he was free from the constraints of his past. Sophie, too, seemed thrilled with the fresh start. She enjoyed the attention and the lifestyle that David provided, and the two of them spent their days traveling, enjoying life, and indulging in pleasures that had previously been out of reach for both of them. However, as time went on, the reality of their situation began to settle in. Sophie wanted more than just the excitement of a carefree relationship. She talked about starting a family, something David hadn't given much thought to. He hesitated at first, unsure if he was ready for the responsibility that came with having children. But as Sophie's excitement grew, he found himself giving in to the idea. He thought that maybe having children would bring them closer, would solidify their bond in a way that nothing else could. It wasn't long before Sophie became pregnant. The news was a shock to David at first, but as the months passed, he began to warm up to the idea of becoming a father. He imagined the joy of having a family with Sophie, a family that would be his own, one that was entirely separate from the life he had shared with Emily. The thought of raising children with Sophie felt like the perfect way to build a future together, one that was completely free from the past. As Sophie's pregnancy progressed, David started to see the future more clearly. He pictured the life they would have, the family they would raise, and the happiness that would come with it. But little did he know, his decision to leave Emily and start over would soon lead him down a path that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, family, and the choices he had made. As the months went by, David's life with Sophie began to take shape in ways he hadn't expected. He was now a father-to-be, and the reality of starting a family with her started to set in. Sophie's pregnancy was progressing, and with each passing day, David found himself becoming more and more excited about the future. The thought of raising a child with Sophie, of creating a new family together, felt like the right thing to do. It was a chance for him to create a life that was entirely his own, one where he could leave the past behind and build something new. However, as happy as David was about the idea of becoming a father, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was missing. He still hadn't fully come to terms with the fact that he had left Emily. The guilt that had initially been pushed aside began to resurface, and it made him question whether he had made the right decision. He had told himself that he deserved to be happy, that starting fresh with Sophie was the best choice, but the lingering thought of Emily, of their life together, still haunted him. Sophie, on the other hand, was glowing with excitement. She was thrilled about the pregnancy, and she couldn't wait to welcome their children into the world. She was already making plans for their future together, imagining what their family would look like once the babies arrived. She was eager to be a mother and was excited about all the changes that were coming. For her, this was the life she had always dreamed of, a life with David, the man she loved, and soon, a family to complete it. David tried to focus on the joy of the moment, pushing aside his doubts. But as Sophie's pregnancy advanced, he began to feel a growing sense of pressure. Being a father was a huge responsibility, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. He had always been focused on his career and his success, and now, with a family on the way, he had to reconsider his priorities. It was a lot to take in, but Sophie's excitement helped ease his fears. She made him feel like everything was going to be okay, like together they could handle whatever came their way. The couple's life was full of preparations. They picked out baby names, decorated the nursery, and spent countless hours talking about their future. For the first time in a long time, David felt like he had a clear purpose. He wasn't just working to build an empire anymore. He was working to build a family. It was a shift in his mindset, one that made him feel more grounded, more focused on what truly mattered. Despite his growing excitement, David couldn't completely shake the doubts that lingered in the back of his mind. He had left Emily for a reason, but now, as he prepared to welcome children into the world with Sophie, he wondered if he had made a mistake. He tried not to dwell on it, convincing himself that the future with Sophie and their children would be everything he had hoped for. But deep down, He couldn't help but question if he had truly let go of his past, or if it was still there, lingering just below the surface. As Sophie's due date grew closer, David's life seemed to shift entirely. What had once been a life focused on business, luxury, and success was now centered on family. He had never imagined he would be here, in this moment, but he couldn't deny that the excitement of becoming a father was beginning to feel real. He looked forward to the day he would hold his children in his arms and watch Sophie become the mother he had always hoped she would be. It was a new chapter, and David couldn't help but wonder what the future would hold for him and his new family. But he also knew that no matter what happened, nothing would ever be the same again. Years passed, and the life David had carefully built with Sophie started to feel more like reality than a dream. They had welcomed their children, 4 beautiful, healthy babies who had completely changed their world. David's days were now filled with diaper changes, late-night feedings, and the overwhelming joy of watching his children grow. Sophie was everything David had hoped she would be as a mother. She was caring, nurturing, and seemed to handle the responsibilities of parenthood with ease. Their home was filled with laughter, and for the first time in a long time, David felt at peace. But as time went on, the shadow of his past continued to hover over him. Despite the joy his new family brought him, David couldn't entirely forget the life he had left behind with Emily. It was something he rarely thought about, but there were moments when it would creep into his mind, like a ghost he couldn't shake. Emily had once been his everything, and though he tried to convince himself that he had made the right choice, there were times when he wondered what could have been if he had stayed. David tried to suppress these feelings, choosing instead to focus on the present, the life he had with Sophie and their children. Yet he couldn't help but feel a sense of longing when he heard about Emily's life. He had heard through mutual friends that she had moved on, built a life for herself, and was happy. It seemed like Emily had found peace, while he was still caught between 2 worlds, the life he had built with Sophie and the life he had left behind. One evening, while attending a business charity event, David's world was turned upside down. He walked into the grand hall, as usual, focused on his role as a wealthy businessman. The event was full of old acquaintances, business partners, and friends. But as he scanned the room, his eyes landed on a familiar face, the face of Emily. She stood across the room, looking as beautiful as ever. It was the first time he had seen her in years. The sight of her hit him like a wave, bringing with it a flood of memories. He watched her for a moment, uncertain of what to do. Emily seemed different. She was no longer the woman he had left behind. There was a strength in her presence that hadn't been there before. She wasn't the fragile woman he remembered. There was something about her that made David realize just how much time had passed. She was no longer his, and the realization hit him hard. David knew that he couldn't just approach her like nothing had happened. So instead of walking up to her, he stayed at the edge of the room, watching her from afar. He couldn't help but notice how comfortable she seemed, how she was surrounded by friends and acquaintances, just as he had been when they were together. Emily had clearly moved on, and in that moment, David realized that the life he had once shared with her was gone. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and David could see the recognition in her gaze. It was a brief, silent exchange, one that spoke volumes. Emily didn't seem angry or resentful. Instead, she gave him a quiet smile, the kind of smile that showed she had long since let go of the past. She had moved forward with her life, and David couldn't help but admire her strength. After the event, David found himself deep in thought. It was clear that Emily had found happiness without him, and he couldn't help but feel a mixture of pride for her and regret for himself. His life with Sophie and their children was everything he had wanted, but there was a part of him that wondered if he had lost something irreplaceable by leaving Emily. The past had a way of haunting him, reminding him of what he had once had and what he had given up. The reunion with Emily left David with more questions than answers. He tried to shake the feeling, but deep down, he knew that seeing her had brought back emotions he hadn't been prepared for. He couldn't help but think about the life they could have had, but he also realized that he couldn't change the past. All he could do now was continue moving forward with Sophie and their children. But the encounter with Emily would remain with him, a reminder of what once was and the choices that had brought him to where he was now. The next few weeks were a whirlwind for David. He couldn't shake the memory of that encounter with Emily. Seeing her at the charity event had brought everything rushing back. Old memories, old emotions, and questions about the past that he thought he had long buried. Despite his best efforts to push these thoughts aside, they lingered. David had built a life with Sophie and their children, and in many ways he was happy. But something inside him was unsettled. The days after the event, David found himself distracted. At work, he was no longer fully focused on his business, something that had always been his top priority. He missed meetings, made careless mistakes, and even started to feel the strain in his relationship with Sophie. She noticed it too. Sophie could see the change in him, the way he seemed lost in thought more often, the way he pulled away when she tried to talk to him. At first, she brushed it off as stress or fatigue, but deep down, she knew something else was going on. One evening, as they sat down for dinner with their children, Sophie asked David if everything was all right. Her voice was soft, but there was a clear concern in her eyes. David hesitated. He didn't want to hurt her, and he didn't want to cause unnecessary tension. He had built a life with Sophie, and their children were the most important thing to him. But the weight of the past, of his past with Emily, was proving difficult to carry. "I'm fine," David lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." But Sophie wasn't convinced. She had seen enough to know that something was wrong. She didn't press him further that night, but the conversation lingered in her mind. She loved David, and she wanted to understand what was troubling him. But at the same time, she couldn't help but feel the tension between them growing. The once carefree, happy atmosphere in their home seemed to be slipping away, and Sophie was left wondering if David's heart was still fully with her. The next few days were filled with silence between them. David tried to throw himself into his work, hoping that burying himself in business would help him forget the nagging questions about his past. But it didn't work. Every time he saw Sophie smile, or every time he held one of his children, a small part of him wondered if Emily was still in his heart. He tried to justify his actions. He had left Emily for a reason, and he had moved on. He had made a choice to build a life with Sophie, and now he had a family that depended on him. But the past seemed to have a way of creeping in when he least expected it. One afternoon, David received a call from an old friend, a mutual acquaintance from his past. The friend had heard about the charity event and casually mentioned Emily in their conversation. They spoke briefly about her life, about how she had flourished after their divorce, and how she seemed happier than ever. The conversation was innocent enough, but it hit David harder than he expected. He couldn't deny the feelings that had been stirred up again. The life he had shared with Emily, the love they had once had, now seemed so distant, like a dream he could never return to. David felt a pang of longing, not just for Emily, but for the life they could have had if things had been different. He realized that he had never truly let go of her, no matter how hard he had tried. That night, David lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet, save for the soft sounds of his children sleeping down the hall. He thought about his choices, about the path he had taken, and the person he had become. Sophie had given him everything he needed in a partner: love, support, and a family. But he wondered if he had ever truly let go of his past, of the woman who had been his partner before. David had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. But as he drifted off to sleep, one thing was clear. His heart was no longer as simple as it once was. The past, the present, and the future were all tangled together, and he didn't know how to untangle them. Days turned into weeks, and David continued to wrestle with the emotional turmoil that had begun to consume him. The life he had carefully constructed with Sophie and their children was slipping through his fingers. His thoughts kept drifting back to Emily, and no matter how much he tried to focus on the present, He couldn't escape the questions that haunted him. Had he made the right choice all those years ago? Was this life with Sophie truly what he wanted, or was he just trying to outrun the past? Sophie, though unaware of the full extent of David's inner turmoil, could feel the change in their relationship. There was a distance between them now, a space that hadn't existed before. She noticed the way David seemed distracted, how he often lost himself in thought when they were together. He wasn't the man she had fallen in love with, and though she didn't understand the reason, she could sense something was wrong. One evening, after putting the children to bed, Sophie sat down with David in the living room. The house was quiet, the only sound coming from the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Sophie looked at him, her eyes filled with concern. She had been patient with him, hoping that he would open up on his own, but now she felt like the walls were closing in around them. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. "David, what's going on?" Sophie asked gently, her voice steady but laced with worry. "I know something's bothering you. You haven't been yourself lately." David's heart sank. He had been trying so hard to keep his feelings buried, to pretend that everything was okay. But Sophie's question pierced through his defenses. He had promised himself that he would never hurt her, that he would be the husband and father she deserved. But now, with his emotions swirling, he didn't know what to say. I don't know," David replied, his voice shaky. "I think I'm just confused. I've been thinking a lot about the past, about the decisions I made." Sophie frowned, her brows furrowing in concern. "The past," she repeated, as if trying to understand what he meant. "David, we've built a life here. We have our children, our family. What more do you need?" David looked down at his hands, trying to collect his thoughts. Sophie was right. He had everything he could have ever wanted: a loving partner, beautiful children, and a life of comfort. But as much as he tried to convince himself that this was enough, a part of him felt empty. The life with Sophie was real, but the ghost of his past with Emily still lingered. "I don't know if I can ever fully let go of what I had with Emily," David admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't stop thinking about what could have been. I keep wondering if I made the wrong choice." Sophie's expression softened, but there was a tinge of sadness in her eyes. "David, I'm not Emily," she said quietly. "I'm not here to replace her. I'm here because I love you. But you need to decide, David. You can't keep living in the past. We have a family now. We have a future together, but only if you let go of what's holding you back." David sat in silence, her words sinking in. Sophie was right. He had to choose. He couldn't keep drifting between two worlds. He had to commit to the family they had built together. The life with Sophie and their children was real. It was messy and imperfect, but it was his. The next few days were filled with quiet reflection. David spent time alone, thinking about everything that had happened. He thought about Emily, about the life they once shared, and about how much he had loved her. But he also thought about Sophie, the woman who had given him a second chance at happiness, who had given him the family he never thought he would have. David knew that he couldn't change the past. Emily was a chapter in his life that had come to an end, and no matter how much he wished things could have turned out differently, he couldn't go back. What he had with Sophie was real, and he realized that he had been holding on to a version of the past that no longer served him. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, David sat down with Sophie. He took her hand, looking into her eyes with a sense of resolve he hadn't felt in weeks. "Sophie," he began, his voice steady, "I want you to know that I'm here with you. I'm choosing this, choosing us. I've been holding on to things that I can't change, but I'm ready to let go. I'm ready to move forward with you and our family." Sophie's eyes softened, and a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "I'm glad to hear that," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "We can make this work, together." In that moment, David felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had made his decision. The past was behind him, and he was ready to embrace the future with Sophie and their children. It wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to make it work. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but with Sophie by his side, he knew they could face whatever came their way. The weeks that followed David's conversation with Sophie marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. Though the weight of his past had not completely vanished, he found a renewed sense of purpose in the family he had built with Sophie and their children. He woke up each day with a clearer mind, no longer distracted by the nagging doubts that had plagued him for so long. Sophie could see the difference in him too. The tension that had hung in the air for so many months was slowly fading, replaced by an atmosphere of warmth and understanding. David had spent so many years chasing success, building his empire, and trying to create a perfect life that he had overlooked the most important things: love, connection, and the family that needed him. Now, with Sophie and their children, he realized how much he had been missing. He began to understand that his choices had consequences, but they also shaped the man he had become. And while he couldn't undo the past, he could still choose to make the most of the present. Sophie's support was unwavering. She didn't demand perfection, but she expected honesty, and David was learning to give that to her. He started to make more time for her and the children, setting aside his work to be present in the moments that mattered. He joined Sophie in the daily routines of parenthood, sharing in the joy and challenges that came with raising 4 young children. For the first time, David was truly experiencing life as a father and a partner, and it felt like the most fulfilling role he had ever played. The couple spent evenings together, often talking about their future, about the kind of family they wanted to be. They made plans, not just for the next few years, but for a lifetime. David had never been one to imagine a future beyond the next big business deal, but now he found himself thinking about the long term, the memories he wanted to create with his children, the legacy he wanted to leave behind. As time passed, David became more involved with his children. He took them to the park, helped them with their homework, and spent time just talking to them. Each moment felt like a small but significant victory. Sophie noticed how much he had changed, how his priorities had shifted, and it warmed her heart. She knew that this wasn't the same David who had walked out on Emily all those years ago. This was a man who had learned from his mistakes, a man who was learning to cherish the life he had now, and not constantly looking back. But the past wasn't as easily forgotten as David had hoped. One day, as the family was enjoying a day at the beach, David received an unexpected call. It was from Emily. She had heard about the changes in his life and wanted to reach out. David felt a rush of emotions: surprise, guilt, and even curiosity. Sophie noticed the change in his expression and quietly asked if everything was all right. "I just need a moment," David said softly, stepping away to take the call. As he walked toward the shoreline, he listened to Emily's voice. It was calm, even friendly, but it was clear that she wanted to catch up, to talk about what had happened between them. David wasn't sure what to say. Emily had a family now, a life that didn't involve him. And that thought stung. But at the same time, he realized how much time had passed and how much they had both changed. The conversation was brief but meaningful. Emily spoke about her life, her children, and how she had finally found peace. David listened quietly, feeling both a sense of closure and sadness. It was a reminder of the life he had left behind, but it also reinforced the decision he had made. He had chosen Sophie, and he had chosen to build a future with her. That was his reality now. When David returned to Sophie and the children, he felt a weight lifted off his shoulders. He didn't need to carry the burden of his past anymore. The call with Emily had reminded him of the life he had lived, but it also reminded him that the past was just that, past. He had a family now, one that needed him and loved him. And that was enough. Sophie noticed the change in him when he returned. David smiled at her and the children, a genuine smile, and for the first time in a long time, Sophie could see the man she had fallen in love with, the man who was finally at peace with his choices. They spent the rest of the day together, enjoying each other's company, making memories that would last a lifetime. It was a new beginning, one that was built on understanding, love, and the strength to move forward. David knew that life would continue to present challenges and that the past might always be a part of him. But he also knew that he had made the right choice for himself and for his family. And with Sophie by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next, together.